Our first speaker will be after Dr. Steiner, Betty Kale, who was born in 1921 in a small town called Stepfritz, near Frankfurt. In 1933, she was cast out of her jewel and then went to public school for 2 years. But essentially at 14, she was expelled from school and her education, her formal education was over. She did go to a home economics school and then went into forced labor working in the homes of Jews whose Aryan servants had forbidden to work for them, and also at the Home for the Aged in Frankfurt. She was deported to Estonia in September of 1942, experienced 5 labor camps, became a bricklayer, was evacuated back to Germany on a forced march, and experienced time at Stetthof concentration camp and Neuengamme concentration camp. And she was liberated on the 15th of April, 1945, at Bergen-Belsen by English and, as she told me, Scotch troops. Lucille Eichengreen, hopefully some of you are familiar with Lucille's biography, which is on our webpage. She was born in Hamburg in 1925. Suddenly your biography has gone out of my head, Lucille. Do you help me with it?
Attended the private Jewish schools until 1941, and then was deported to the Lodz ghetto, to Neuengamme, to Bergen-Belsen, via Auschwitz.
Your moderator for today is our own Dr. Steiner, who was born in 1925 as well in Czechoslovakia, in Prague. He was deported to Theresienstadt on August 10th, 1942. Spent there and then was eventually sent to Auschwitz. You should be familiar with a great deal of his biography because it's in his reflections. From Auschwitz, he was sent to a labor camp. From the labor camp, spent time in several labor camps, and then made a very arduous journey, which you've read about, those of you who are in the class, and others, back to Dachau. And he was liberated on
the 9th of April.
The 9th of April.
29th. 29th.
The 29th of April, 1945. That seems to be a date that people remember, certainly survivors remember. And so I give you Dr. Steiner.
Thank you much for your very kind and thorough introduction. Now, I'm just here not to talk about myself, but prepare the stage for the speakers for this afternoon, the 2 ladies, and somehow give you some general idea in terms of what I think we ought to focus on when we listen to survivors. And let me just make a few remarks, bear with me, and at the end we can discuss it, which I hope you will when you enter into a dialogue with the 2 survivors, with the 2 ladies. So as we know, I think all of us have that experience, that life consists of merging, fleeting moments, what I call merging, fleeting moments. These moments differ in quality, of course, ranging from very pleasurable, ecstatic, to misery and agony. So this is the range. But I like my wording it, life consists of fleeting moments. Recently, a colleague and fellow survivor, Dr. Paul Benko, died prematurely. He was one of those who could bear witness very eloquently. These fleeting moments I've just mentioned encompass us all, including our panel tonight, who will share with you their horrible experience in Nazi death camps. And I'd like to be very sure that you realize that you are privileged to hear what they have to say. Soon there will be no one left to bear witness of one of the most momentous tragedies of humankind. And I don't have to tell you that anymore, because by now you have some idea in terms of what it involved and what people had to go through in these so-called death camps. Yet even those who have experienced the Holocaust can only relate but not transmit their experience. Only relate but not transmit. This is one of the major reasons, so it seems to me, why it is so difficult to learn from history and avoid previously committed errors and horrors. Perhaps someday soon we will be able to remedy this shortcoming by applying modern, what we call today virtual reality, high-tech sort of things, virtual devices with which it may be possible to transmit experience. And I don't think that's very far around the corner. I think we are getting ready of it, and some of you see already very interesting movies relating to just that. But let me briefly illustrate what I mean by the difference between transferring experience and transmitting experience and relating experience. Last summer, I flew back to the Bay Area from Europe, and during that flight, I suddenly lost my hearing, and I mean totally, because of a throat infection apparently, or whatever infection it must have been, while the plane was descending San Francisco, and before that Chicago. Although I have a number of friends who have hearing problems, and foremost one of my favorite aunts who also was a survivor and totally, and I mean totally, stone deaf, I thought that I was in a position to empathize and understand people with hearing problems. After my experience in the I realized how wrong I was. Because without the experience, I had no idea what to be really deaf entailed. How much more difficult, as you can imagine, is it to fully comprehend the suffering, the trauma, the experience of survivors. It's virtually impossible. Not even in your wildest nightmare can you relate to what some of the survivors have experienced. So I would urge you to take advantage of the presence of our guests and enter into a dialogue with them after their presentation, so that you can better comprehend what needs to be avoided in the future, hopefully, and I say hopefully, with your help, based on your acquired understanding and knowledge, the very reason why we all are here, namely to prevent genocides. What is involved to bring about genocide is a question we need to ask ourselves. What does it take to survive it? The second question. With what means did the people who have survived? Can we learn from it? Is another question. How have survivors applied their experience in everyday life after World War II? On a final note, occasionally one hears that the persecuted who were sent to camps, to death camps, went to their slaughter supposedly like sheep. Nothing could be further truth. To survive meant to resist. Those who were unable to resist had virtually no chance to survive at all, unless they were miraculously lucky. So the most accurate introduction of this afternoon's speakers is above all and foremost the fact that they are survivors. I'll leave it to them to share with you their experience and what they have done with their life after the Holocaust and what contribution they have made to humanity, survivors, and human beings who went through hell and survived. So let us listen very attentively to the two speakers and be sure that you ask questions and enter into a dialogue with them. The first will be Kale and will be followed by Lucille Eichengreen. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to see such a large gathering here, and I hope you'll bring wisdom with you after you leave this gathering. In May 1945, almost 54 years ago, World War II came to an end. Germany was defeated, and the horrors of the concentration camps became officially known to the world. The word Holocaust was adopted for the slaughter of 6 million Jews and the torture of countless others. I am a survivor of that carnage. The Random House Webster College Dictionary defines the word Holocaust as a great or complete devastation or destruction by fire. In May of 1933, just 3 months after Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany, I learned what total destruction by fire means. It was a balmy day, and my 12-year-old classmates and I were told by our teacher to appear at dusk on the outskirts of town on a specific field. When we got there, we found the field littered with hundreds of books written by Jewish and by writers who did not agree with the Nazi ideology. As the sun was setting on the horizon, we could hear the swishing sound, and little by little small flames started to lurch towards the sky. Suddenly, the heavens became lit up as the flames soared higher and higher from that bonfire. The Nazi shirts and many of the bystanders started to sing and shout that someday the Jews will burn and be destroyed just like these books. This was my first experience of total destruction by fire. On November the 9th, 1938, the night of the broken glass, the Kristallnacht, my second experience of totalization by fire experience. In the early morning hours, I saw the blackened sky over the city of Frankfurt. Later on, I went to the sites where there had once been beautiful synagogues, and now there was nothing but rubble and devastation. The ultimate total destruction by fire I lived through was the Holocaust itself. I spent 3 years in labor and concentration camps where the smell of burning human bodies was overwhelming at times. Now I will tell you a little of the beginning of my odyssey. True, one forgets lots of details of what happened over a half a century ago, yet so much horror is remembered. I was born and lived until the age of 14 in a small farming village of Sterfritz in Germany. The village had 1,200 residents, of which about 100 were Jewish. Jews and Gentiles had lived harmoniously side by side for over 300 years in that little village. We lived a comfortable life until Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. Early on in that year, the Nazi brown shirts were sent to our little town to agitate the population of the village against the Jews. Public school teachers, although they had been friends of the Jewish families, became vicious anti-Semites. We, the Jewish children, had to sit in classrooms and listen as the teachers preached that Jews are the root of all the evil that had befallen Germany, and that they must be done away with. We were even forced to participate in the most hateful anti-Semitic songs like Köpfe rollen, Juden heulen, which means heads are rolling, Jews are howling. Children are easily misled, and they constantly harassed and physically assaulted us. In sewing class, a teacher, a Mrs. Schotte, instigated the girls to stick needles into my body. Another teacher, a Mr. Weitling, hung Jewish youngsters by their feet on trees and let them dangle for the amusement of the others. On another occasion, the same teacher took these children to the public swimming pool and dumped them into the deep end of the water. None of them could swim. When they were pulled out of the pool, they were barely alive. My brother was one of those youngsters. Having been subjected to constant stress and aggravation, my father died of a heart attack in May 1935 at the age of 49. Between the years of 1935 and 1940, many Jews were able to emigrate from Germany. I have often been asked why my family remained there. We stayed because we simply did not have the financial means to purchase passage to South America, Shanghai, or any other safe haven. I will never forget November the 9th, 1938, the Kristallnacht, known as the Night of the Broken Glass. Synagogues were destroyed, Jewish store windows were smashed, and the stores were looted. Private homes were ransacked, and valuables were carted away. 30,000 Jews were arrested, and many, many brutally murdered. The next day, November the 10th, Jews fled their little towns with whatever they could carry of their belongings, seeking shelter in the cities. My family, too, had to leave our home. At the time, I was doing forced domestic work in a home for the aged in Frankfurt. 4 o'clock in the morning, responding to frantic banging on the door, I was shocked beyond belief when I saw my mother and aunt bedraggled and frozen with fright. My uncle was bleeding profusely. He had been beaten beyond recognition. November the 9th, 1938 was thus the beginning of the systematic annihilation of the Jews in Germany. September the 24th, 1942 will always be vivid in my mind. That day, my mother, sister, myself, and hundreds of others were deported from Frankfurt, Germany. SS men, strutting and cursing, shoved us into railroad cars. As we were herded into the train, an unconscious woman with horrible red welts around her neck was brought on a stretcher and loaded onto the train. She had hung herself, but her heart was still beating faintly when the Nazis came to pick her up in her apartment. Almost dead, she too could not escape deportation. Nobody, but nobody can tell me that the German people, the world at large, did not know of our horrible fate. As this macabre spectacle at the railroad depot in Frankfurt unfolded, hundreds of German civilians were standing on an overpass, watching it all. On that horrible journey into the unknown, I sat squeezed onto a seat next to a young nursing mother. Her infant was whimpering incessantly until he could whimper no more. Since we had had no food and hardly any water for days, this mother could not feed her child, and he, with many others on that train, died. After many days on this nightmare trip, we arrived in a desolate place called Raseku, located somewhere north of the town of Tallinn in Estonia. We were ordered to get off the train, and the life or death selections began. Out of the approximately 1,200 people on that train, 100 young women and 70 men were selected to stay alive for the time being, to do hard physical labor. My mother and sister were torn away from me to be killed. We later learned that the peculiar windowless buses they were shoved into were mobile gas chambers. Thus, my mother, my sister, my friends, and my community were exterminated by asphyxiation. We, the 100 young women, were brought to a camp called Jägerla. Our sleeping quarter was a wooden barrack without glass in the window frames. Our beds were tiers of wooden planks. There were no blankets for us. By now, it was October and very, very cold in Estonia, and we were freezing. Our first job was to unpack and assort the bundles and bags of the people who were on the same transport with us, but now dead. Thus, coats, shoes, and whatever they had with them were ready to be shipped back to Germany, to be used by the German people. We also had to chop down ice-covered trees to make a better access road for the next shipment of Jews. After about 1 month in Jägerla, we were brought to an ancient jail in the city of Tallinn. From that jail, we were escorted every morning by submachine gun-toting guards to our slave labor workplace, the bombed upper of Tallinn. During the winter months in sub-zero weather, we had to clear debris from the bombed-out buildings and scrape all mortar off the fallen bricks. We also had to carry 100-pound bags of lime and cement to the work site, all in preparation for our next job. Lime is a very caustic substance, and since we did not have the necessary protective clothing to carry those torn bags, we suffered skin burns constantly. When the weather permitted to mix cements, we were forced to become bricklayers. We spent 2 years in 5 different slave labor camps in Estonia, where we were physically forced to work very hard. We were always hungry, we were cold, and we were terrified. And we felt totally abandoned by the so-called civilized world. While in Estonia, babies were born to some of our young women. Nurses among us were forced to deliver those babies and dump them head first into buckets of water, thus eliminating another generation of Jews. The weak and the sick were periodically picked from our group and sent to their death. In 1944, it became apparent that the Germans were losing the war in Russia. Once again, we had to be moved, and this time back to Germany. The still fairly healthy women from various camps in Estonia were brought to the outskirts of Tallinn. There, we spent 3 weeks on an open field without any shelter until a boat or trip across the Baltic Sea became available. During this time, the ones unable to continue doing slave labor were slaughtered. Finally, we were herded into a boat, standing room only. It took 3 days to cross the Baltic Sea. It was 3 days without water and only 1 slice of bread per day. And it was 3 days without any sanitation facilities. We finally arrived in the concentration camp of Stutthof in Germany. Weak, tired, and dirty, we had to stand roll call for endless hours. Whoever fainted was revived by being doused with a bucket of cold water. The following day, we had to totally undress, climb under stools, as S-men examined us internally, supposedly looking for valuables. Then our heads and all our body hair was shaved. 3 weeks in Stutthof, which was a virtual hell on earth, 500 of us were selected for slave labor in an ammunition factory. Once again, we were shoved onto a train and arrived days later in a labor camp called Neuengamme, which was not very far from Hamburg, Germany. After about 7 months in Neuengamme, air raid sirens were heard many times. We could hear the reverberating gun battles close by, and we knew if we could hang on just a little while longer, we would be able to survive and tell. But once again, the Germans had to torture us some more. This time, they transported us to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The last few miles to the camp, we had to walk, and whoever was too weak to walk was shot and was left by the side of the road. Adequate words to describe the conditions in Bergen-Belsen simply do not exist. 10,000 dead bodies and thousands of dying people were lying in the walkways, on the feces-covered sleeping planks, and dead bodies were floating in the pond, the only supply of the camp. We, the latest arrivals, were forced to drag these dead and dying people and stack them up like cordwood. I can still hear the moans of a dying person as 4 of us had to each take an arm or a leg and move these people to the already high piles of lost humanity. I will never forget searching faces of the dead and the walking skeletons for someone I might have once known. And I still see us survivors, sick with typhus, too weak to walk, trying to help each other get to the so-called latrine. 40,000 people were liberated in Bergen-Belsen on April the 15th in 1945. For 28,000 of those, liberation came too late. They died shortly after being freed. I would like to add one pertinent fact. Not only Jews were annihilated, millions of other people, the mentally retarded, nuns and priests, people with politically different views, and many, many others were killed. Before closing, I'd like you to look at 4 slides which my husband Harold took on our trip to Frankfurt last year. Oh, I need the light for a minute too. These 4 pictures should tell you more than anything I told you today. In November of 1997, Monica Eichengreen, a German researcher who writes about Jewish communities in Germany, asked me to work on a film about my experiences under the Nazi regime, the deportation process, and life in the concentration camp. At her urging, the city of Frankfurt invited us to visit there last year. A film was made for teacher education and for use by the Fritz Bauer Research Institute. Slide 1. This memorial plaque shows just one of the many synagogues that were destroyed on November the 9th, 1938 in the city of Frankfurt. So all we have left is one plaque. Slide number 2, please. This is me standing in front of a wall which totally surrounds an ancient Jewish cemetery. On this wall are 1,000 little plaques, and each plaque has the name of a Jewish man, woman, or child who was deported from Frankfurt and killed in the camps. 11,000 people were deported. Just a few of us came back. I am one of the few that came back. The next plaque will show you, plaque number 2, please. Margot Schuster, born October the 20th in 1922. My sister, whom I was deported with, I found her name on that wall. Plaque number 3, or 4. Rosa Schuster. Her maiden name was Steinfeld. She was born in 1894. I was with her when we left the train in Estonia. She and my sister were killed in those windowless buses. And that was the remnant of what I found of my family. Thank you very much for listening.
It took me 55 years to return to Germany and to Poland, to face what I really never wanted to face again. Have we learned from the past? I asked myself. The answer is very little, if at all. No, we have not learned from the past. I remember January 1933, when Hitler came to power. I remember in our school the teacher saying, be quiet, be invisible, don't draw attention to yourself, but that didn't help. The German kids would beat us up regardless. In summer of 1933, for the first time, I heard the word anti-Semitism. I could not understand it. My father tried to explain, it was way beyond my comprehension. I was 8 years old. My mother told me that when she was a youngster, she was told the Cossacks were coming and her mother hid her in a stove. All the young girls had to be hidden. I still did not understand. My only comment was, it must have been summer. It couldn't have been winter, otherwise you couldn't hide in a stove. But gradually, restrictions grew stronger and stronger, and discrimination against Jews was more severe. I realized that we were not wanted, that there was something wrong with us, and most of my colleagues, my classmates, wanted to leave. But the grown-ups said, it's a passing phase. Don't worry, it'll blow over and we'll have a different government. The different government never came. We should have taken our cue on November 10th, when we were walking to school. We saw the burning synagogues, men were arrested, and they were released from concentration camps within 6 months with lost teeth, very gaunt, shaven heads, and they fled Germany. This should have been a sign for the rest of us that it was time to get out. We still did not heed this warning. The Germans started in 1941, while they were already at war with Great Britain, to deport Jews from various cities throughout Germany, and the destination was the East. East was no concept for us. After 3 days in train cars, we loaded in a place called Lodz, a large industrial city in the center, similar to Manchester, England. And we were told that the Jews would be housed in a ghetto. Well, the only ghetto I had ever heard of was the last ghetto that was in existence in Italy around 1450, and I could not possibly imagine what this would be like. It was a small area in a slum of a large city, the worst kind of a slum, that had been partitioned off, surrounded by barbed wire, sentry guards. We had no sewers. We had open sewers on the streets. We walked over them as we crossed. We had no running water. There was a pump in the courtyard. There was little electricity, if any. There was no coal to heat the rooms, and there was very little food. We worked for the Germans. the head of the Jewish administration was Chaim Rumkowski. And he had a tremendous organizational talent. He sold the Germans on the idea that we could produce anything, provided we got food. The Germans promised food, and we produced the uniforms for the German army, the snowshoes out of straw for the Russian front, the mess kits for the German army, hats for the ladies in Germany, and you name it, we produced it. But the food did not come. The food came at irregular intervals, and it was never enough to even go to bed one evening and say, I'm not hungry. Over 70,000 people died of starvation in the ghetto and are buried in the cemetery adjacent to the ghetto. We buried them ourselves. At any one time, the ghetto had 50,000 human beings. When new transports were brought into the ghetto from Vienna, from Prague, from Frankfurt, from Berlin, from anywhere, the Germans would organize a deportation of either the old, the weak, the sick, or the very young, in order that the number of ghetto inhabitants able to work would remain at a steady 150, 160,000 souls. In 1942, my mother died of starvation, and my sister and I buried her. A few months later, the Germans demanded 20,000 children out of the ghetto below the age of 11. And the head of the Judenrat, or of the administration, made a speech, roughly translated, mothers and fathers, hand over your children so that the rest of us may live. I was 17 years old. I could not understand it then. I now understand it much less. The process was too slow for the Germans, and the Germans imposed a curfew, 7-day curfew, and with trucks and dogs, they went house to house throughout the ghetto and picked up those they thought were too old to work, the young ones, the very young ones, small children. And by the end of the week, they had between 15 and 18,000 human beings that just disappeared. We did not know where, how, or what. We found out 10 years later that they were taken to a place called Chelmo, gassed and buried in mass graves. My sister was among them. Life in the ghetto continued. We still believed to some extent that maybe, just maybe, the Germans will let us live. We did not know that the Russian armies were advancing, that they were less than 20 kilometers away from the ghetto, and they did not move, they did not advance. They gave the Germans enough time in August of 1944 to round up all inhabitants of the ghetto except for 800 who managed to hide. And all the trains ultimately ended up in Auschwitz. Well, I don't have to tell you about Auschwitz. You have probably heard and read more than enough about it. From Auschwitz, those who were deemed able to work were then to various working camps or slave labor camps throughout Germany. And I believe there were a total of 400 of them. Whether it's accurate, I do not know, but I've been told that. We did hard physical labor, from concrete work to cleaning up shipyards, to cleaning up bomb damage from the British the night before. And we did not believe that the war would come to an end. There was no information forthcoming. The one radio to which we had access and which a friend of mine and a friend of Dr. Steiner's repaired occasionally, only gave us the news which we really did not need. The British were advancing, the Germans were retreating, the Americans were in North Africa. That was of no importance to us. We wanted to know who would help us, who would bring guns and ammunition, food. We saw the sky bright red in 1943 in spring. We heard a rumbling noise, but we did not know that the Warsaw Ghetto was afire. It was only 2 hours away. We had no idea till much, much later. The last place I worked for the Germans was near Hamburg, the city where I was born. And from there we were marched and driven in trucks to a place that I only remember at the entrance with 2 huge mountains of shoes. No feet, no legs, used shoes, old shoes, large shoes and small ones. And the place was called Bergen-Belsen. As you have heard already, Bergen-Belsen was totally diseased, and if it had taken much longer than April 15th, I think most of us would not have survived Bergen-Belsen. The British stumbled upon the camp. They did not come to liberate us. They came to advance along the river Elbe towards the north to cut off the Russian army. They stumbled upon the camp. Nobody came to look for us. They tried to bring in medication, they tried to bring in food. It was too little and too late, and only a few of us survived. The British didn't let us out of the camp. They were afraid that we would spread typhus. They were afraid that we would take revenge on the Germans and go on a killing spree. And to get out of Bergen-Belsen, you had to have a special permit. And that took quite a few until people went out anyway. You couldn't keep them in. But until they legally were permitted to leave. I worked for the British War Crimes Division, and we managed to arrest 42 former SS. I gave a deposition, I received threats, and I was driven to Paris. From Paris, I made it to New York. The Germans received sentences ranging from 3 years to roughly 8 years. They all went out much earlier on parole. And when I heard that, I was speechless. So much for war crimes. They were all innocents according to their testimony, and they received civil service jobs. They retired with substantial pensions, and when I applied for a pension and went to just April, I was told, claim denied. And when I asked, what does the former SS and the Wehrmacht get? And they said, oh, they get very substantial pensions. I said, so much for justice. So you will understand that I have my prejudices when it comes to Germans. I have some hope for the young ones. And I have gone to Germany, to several universities, and talked to students and tried to explain. While their teachers are trying, their parents and grandparents are not. They're not telling them about the past. They're not admitting any wrongdoing of any sort. And the young students are really confused. When I was in Hamburg at the university, the synagogue in the city of Lübeck was firebombed that previous night. I made a remark to the effect that such behavior is no longer acceptable and it's not to be condoned by anyone. And I felt that the German chancellor, who I was known Kohl, should have made it his business to fly to the city of Lübeck and make a statement to that effect. One of the students got up and told me in no uncertain terms that I had insulted the chancellor. I told him that in America we have such a thing as a First Amendment and free speech. And I explained it to them, but I don't think they comprehended. I told them they are a democracy now, but they had a long way to go. So my visits to Germany are painful at best. I do go because I hope if I can convince one person, it will have been worthwhile. But we have learned very, very little from the past. Thank you.
I'd like to add a few words. I went to Germany last year. I also spoke in June in different schools. There was no questions after I got through speaking. I speak here in schools, and the students ask all kinds of questions. In Germany, they were totally quiet. There was not one question asked. And I went away feeling they are still the same as they were 50 years ago.
We're all going to show that we're not like that, aren't we? I would like to entertain questions from you. Students first. Betty Kale.
Betty, what happened to your brother?
Yeah, what happened to Betty's brother?
Oh. My brother was 12 years old when he was in the orphanage in Frankfurt. At the time, there were children's transports that were taken out of Germany. He was on a transport to France, which was sponsored by the Rothschild family. He spent about a year in and around Paris, and then the Germans came to overrun Paris, and the children were moved to the southern part of France, and they finally were rescued by the American Quakers to the United States. I don't know the exact time, but the American Quakers brought these children over here. And he's now living in Las Vegas.
Thank you. Look to the others.
Students first.
Student first, yeah.
Inquiring minds.
For Betty, please. I was wondering if after, for you, were you able to return to your home as you knew your home for the first years of your life?
This is a very long story. We had a house in a small town. And when Hitler came to power in 1933, it was rented out to a German. And after we were liberated in Bergen-Belsen, it was total chaos in Germany. You can go onto any train and you'd say, I want to go here, I want to go there, if you could find a train that was running. Anyhow, I way home to the little town where I had come from, and I walked into the house that this man had rented from my parents, and there was a store in front of the house. When I walked into that store and he saw me, he almost had a heart attack, because he thought this house was now his house, because he had lived in there for so many years. And when I walked in, I said, you better be out of here within 2 hours, because this is not your house, this is my house. Then my brother came with the United States Army months later, and he checked on it. The store was empty, but the bedrooms were still occupied, and he threw them out of the rest of the house, because he was an ardent Nazi, and he thought this was a free house he could get from the Jews.
This is for either of the panelists. I'm wondering, because we've seen and heard different things about the social and economic conditions in Germany before the war, and I'm wondering what your experience was. Betty, I think you spoke about being in a small farming town. I'm just wondering if it was a difficult time or how it was socially and economically.
I was a young child in 1933. I remember that my father had a business in the industrial section of town. And when the 1st of May was celebrated, and just the year prior to Hitler coming to power, the flags were red, hammer and sickle. There was massive unemployment, there was poverty. I know now, which I did not know as a child, that the Germans paid heavy reparations at the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. They had an inflation in 1922, and they never really recovered. And it is said that this was one of the reasons that Hitler, with his promises, managed to seize power.
John, did you have a comment you wanted to make about economic and social conditions?
Well, the important thing for us to remember that the more we experience what we call existential fear or existential angst, the more susceptible we are to ideologies and leaders who will suggest very short, simple solutions for very difficult problems. And therefore, because of the susceptibility, so many people want to believe those people who claim to have answers. And that is a very important thing, that whenever there is socio-economic instability in a given society, the people within this society will be more susceptible to ideological persuasion, appeals to emotion, which will then sway them to support leaders who most of these leaders are, for all practical purposes, demagogues, people who will mislead rather than lead responsibly.
Did you want to respond to that?
The small town I lived in was a very poor town. People had a few acres of land, and whatever they could grow, they lived on. Very little work. It was in a depression, and people just had very, very little. And the Jews of the town were poorer than the rest of the people. And when Hitler came to power, we had nothing. The food was cut off. This was in 1933. I was 12 years old. This was a very anti-Semitic area, and they cut us off from everything right in 1933. At the time, I was 12 years old. Thank you.
Excuse me. Question for both Lucille and Betty. What were the thoughts that were going through your mind the night of November the 9th, 1938? Were you hiding in a closet, fearful for your life, or what was going on the night of Kristallnacht?
In the city of Hamburg, which roughly had inhabitants, we did not know on November 9th what was happening. We found out early in the morning of November 10th, when we saw the burning synagogues, the looted stores, the broken glass, the merchandise floating in the canals in the city, and we saw the Gestapo going from house to house, picking up Jewish men between the ages of 16 and 65, roughly. Then we had an idea, but no, really, we didn't know. We were absolutely taken by surprise.
The only way I knew what was happening, my mother, my aunt, and uncle came in the middle of the night from another small town. I was working in Frankfurt at the time. They had been beaten up, and they told us what was happening in the small towns. Naturally, we could smell the smoke of the burning synagogues. In fact, the SS had come. I was working in a home for the aged. The SS had come, and we had big pots of soup on the stoves, and they just came in and took the pots of soup and dumped them into the sinks. So we had 100 people to feed. We had nothing to give them. And it was just a horrible side to have all these people there and not being able to take care of them. And then my mother and aunt and uncle that came beaten up in the middle of the night. We saw the burning synagogues later on the next day.
What was it that came from inside you that you guys didn't give up? What was it that kept you guys going through this whole ordeal?
I can only speak for myself. I had given up. I was sick, I had typhus, and if my friends had not brought me water and taken care of me as best as they could, I would not be here. Another friend took me off a transport out of the ghetto, and I remained in the ghetto. That transport went, and the people on the train were never heard from again. A will to live, no. There was no more will to live. It was either fate or luck, or whatever you wish to call it. But it didn't matter anymore.
It was friendship that kept me alive. A woman that was possibly 10 years older than I was, she kind of treated me like a younger sister or a mother to me. She had a lot of guts. When we were working in Estonia, she took whatever clothes she didn't need and she went to farmers. We were in an open area. She went to farmers and she bartered her clothes for bread or for whatever she could get. She was shot in the hand. There was no medical service for her. Her arm grew together terribly crooked. It was first corrected in the United States years later. But she was the one that kept me alive. She was quite a bit older. She's not with us anymore. Thank you.
There is one thing which perhaps is very important, that most people lost hope in extreme stress situations. But what kept them going was very frequently, I wouldn't say frequently, kept them going was actually a drive of self-preservation and self-reliance, because in extreme situation you didn't have any friend or any person who would support you, because everyone fought for their own life. And that was the extreme situation. And there are different types of situations which were less extreme, which were more survivable. But the least survivable were precisely those which evoked the drive of self-preservation and absolute self-reliance, because without that, survival was totally impossible. Now, one last word about that also, that because of these two factors, self-preservation and self-reliance, you wanted to survive at any cost. So regardless of this, you survived at the expense very frequently of other people, because people fought each other in order to survive. They competed for life. And that was the extreme situation where you did not need the Nazis to kill you, but people, inmates, killed each other in order to competed with each other for life.
You can see there's no universal survivor experience. Dr. Steiner's description is different than that of Lucille and Betty.
I'm just curious how being a survivor of the Holocaust affects you in your everyday life now.
How does Holocaust survivor affect you in your everyday life now, do you think?
I hope it does not affect me. I try to live as full a life as I can. I do a lot of volunteer work, and I feel every day that I can get up in the morning and I can do something, possibly for somebody else. I feel good about it.
The question has been asked, are we survivors or are we victims? And you can discuss it endlessly. It never completely disappears, but you don't think of it every minute of the day. I have raised 2 boys. They know comparatively little about the past, but I've done a good job, and for that I'm thankful.
Professor Steiner.
The most important thing for me was simply to act how these things are possible and what can I do in not to behave in a way the aggressors who persecuted us, who killed us, behaved. And that became more and more my goal, to become different, to behave humanely, in some way become a role model, and not to fall victim to a type of behavior victimized others. So that, I think, was the most important lesson. Just let me give you a very simple illustration. When I came back from the camps to Prague, I've had many German friends who were everything else but Nazis, but were caught in this dreadful whirlpool in which Nazi society found itself and created people who then, the worst thing just came out of them from the depths of their so-called soul. And I felt that these people were now victimized as we were victimized because they had not done anything. On the contrary, they supported us in the camps. I received parcels from some of these German people and some other friends. So I decided that they could not be treated as we were, as people who had not committed any crime. So I went out to support them, to save their lives when necessary, which I did, and support them not only in everyday life, but protect them from persecution, undue persecution, which they had not deserved because they were just Germans, just like some who happened to be gypsies or Jews. And that, I think, is something very important. I'm very glad I've done it, because somehow it cleansed my soul.
This is for all three. What action would you like to see taken today by the people in the government of Germany to further the reconciliation of their part in history?
Did you hear that?
Yes. True, the young people were not alive when this happened, and they claimed not to know anything because nobody told them. But I have a very deep-seated feeling against all Germans because they don't really want to know. They don't want to face the fact of what happened there 50 years ago.
The Holocaust is a part of history. It ought to be studied by us. It ought to be studied by the Germans. And it should not recur like it recurs in the former country of Yugoslavia. And I wish the Europeans as well as the Americans would look at the past and would act in the present.
What I've done over the years is to go back to the victimizers, to the persecutors, to the people who were the actual killers or were the desk chair perpetrators. To enter into a dialogue, ask them questions, gave them questionnaires to fill in, and studied them. And that was a tremendously interesting experience, which has been already published to some extent, will be published in the future, in terms of the results. Are they different people? And if so, why were they different? What caused them to be different? and I reached certain conclusions which I hopefully will share with you in my forthcoming lecture.
One more.
How do you escape after the war ended, and how were you treated by people that were around
How were you able to get by?
you? By,
Could you be more specific, or?
well, probably not many of you could feel that, live somewhere, eat somewhere, Berkeley to get you to New York, or what happened to your culture?
You come to New York in March 1946. You work in a factory, you live in a furnished room, you eat a candy bar for breakfast, 20-cent sandwich for lunch, and you pick something up in the evening, hopefully very inexpensive. You make $30 a week, of which $5 went for taxes, and you wished you were back in Europe. How do you get by? Well, I met my husband that year, and that helped a great deal. But the Jews that I met in New York did not want to hear about the past, and we were embarrassment to them. We were damaged goods. That they had done very little, if anything, to help us, that was never discussed. I applied for a job in New York, and I was told by the man, we don't hire Jews or Italians. I never thought this would be possible in America, but it was. So how do you get by a day at a time, at best?
First job in New York was as a babysitter or a caretaker of children in the home of an announcer. At the time, there was no television. He was a radio announcer. He was Jewish, and he said to me, "You German Jews deserved what you got." I worked then in an upholstery factory. Somebody tried to teach me how to use a sewing machine, and instead of sewing, I sewed through my fingers. It wasn't easy to get by.
Well, I was very fortunate in contrast to the ladies here, because I came here on a fellowship to the United States from Australia. And I had a very good time, and I was able to do my graduate work and Ph.D. and all these sort of things, and people were very supportive. But interesting enough, none of them.
When you get a chance, I also think you should ask Dr. Steiner about his immediate war experience and why he was in Australia. Thank you all for your attendance and your very, very wonderful behavior. Please sit down. I have something new to tell you. Lucille's book is for sale out in the lobby, and we also, you sign up for your classes, so there is no mad rush to the front. There's a mad rush to the door. Thank you very much.